Hello guys, Professor O'Brien here with a short lecture on adjectivals. And I pressed go live a little bit early. So I've got books and things to move around here. So that puts me on page 158 of rhetorical grammar. Sorry, I'm having to close a few things here. So hold on. Yes. I'm only doing this because I was informed that the sound and the video in these videos sometimes don't mesh, and it might be because there's too much pressure on my system here. So I'm closing as many windows as I can, particularly Adobe, which is a big memory eater. And here we are. We'll see if that makes any difference. Now, adjectivals are more or less the same as adjectives, except they don't necessarily have to be adjectives. So you could give an example like the quick man. Nope, the example I just thought of, poof, is gone. It's a terrible example. The running very quickly man. That's a terrible, terrible example, but you get the idea. Running very quickly is verbal, but it's taking the same spot and place as you might have with quick. And it's an entire phrase, behaving like an adjective. That's all an adjectival is. Now, this chapter opens with a little introduction to the noun phrase. Why is that? It's because you only find adjectives and adjectivals where there are nouns. And you'll see that, well, the claim here is that pretty much everything else in a noun phrase that isn't the head word, that isn't a noun, is an adjective in some way or other. So determiners like the, adjective-ish, adjective themselves, fine. Noun, behaving like an adjective. Head word has to be a noun. And then phrase might contain a verb, for instance, but might not be, might contain a prepositional phrase or something, but might not necessarily be an entire clause. And then a clause. All of these things behave adjectively. So you could conceivably consider the following sentence as a head word plus a large number of adjectivals. The big army helicopter hovering over the roof that frightened my dog. Well, that's just a noun phrase. It isn't a sentence. I hope I didn't say sentence there. If I did, apologies. That's just a noun phrase. We could turn it into a sentence by adding predicate. The big army helicopter hovering over the roof that frightened my dog flew away. There, full sentence. But the determiner, big, adjective, army, noun, but behaving like an adjective, right? Big army helicopter. Helicopter, head word, it's a noun. Phrase, hovering over the roof. You can see, hopefully, that there's no tensed verb there, so it isn't a clause. So it has to be a phrase. And then a clause. That frightened my dog. In this case, relative clause. Okay, so the text breaks things helpfully into pre-head word modifiers. That would be determiners, adjectives, and other nouns. and post-headword modifiers, that is to say, phrases and clauses. Now, if you can't identify a determiner at this stage of the course, you have problems that I can't solve. Your most typical determiner is something like the car, the house, the person. You sometimes hear these described as articles as well. Definite articles like the and indefinite articles like a or an. Possessives, however, are also considered determiners. Johnny's car, the astronaut's spaceship. So don't just look for the or a. Look for possessives or words like these and those. Okay. Note what the text says close to the top of page 159. As the first word in the noun phrase, and thus frequently the first word of the sentence and even of the paragraph, the determiner can provide a bridge between ideas. The selection of that bridge can make a subtle but important difference in emphasis. I totally agree. Providing transition for the reader and can certainly change the rhythm of the sentence. Tackle the group discussion exercise at the bottom of page 159. It's an excellent introduction to determiners and how sometimes they're optional. You will find if you do this exercise with someone else that you're not going to put the same determiners in where you might expect your partner to be putting them in the same way. So everyone has their own individual use for determiners. Okay, the second two groups of pre-headword modifiers are adjectives themselves and nouns. Now, as the text points out, you rarely use more than one noun as a pre-headword modifier, but you can frequently use more than one adjective. A recent covert military operation. 1, 2, 3 adjectives, recent, covert, and military. But you're only usually going to get one noun as a pre-headword modifier. A dismal weather forecast, weather being the noun. Now, when to use commas between adjectives? Well, there's a good rule of thumb in the shaded box on page 161, and I will suggest to you to read the material around it if you like, but this is the crystallization of what the text is trying to say. Use a comma between pre-noun modifiers if and can be used between them. So take a look at the first example in the list on page 160 there, a dismal weather forecast. Could you put commas between dismal and weather? Well, try and. A dismal and weather forecast. Makes no sense. So if you can't put and in there, don't put a comma either. What about the group just below that? A recent covert military operation. A recent and covert and military operation. Nearly works, but I'd say drop the commas still. Right. Interesting point. When to use a hyphen? Typically, you'll put a hyphen between any, let's say, hanging together group of words. Look at the examples 2/3 of the way down page 161. The English-speaking world. A 4-door minivan. Now, you break that example when one of the words is an ly adverb. Look at the example just above them, a highly unusual situation. You never put a hyphen after ly adverbs. So again, look at the shaded rule at the bottom of that page there. Use a hyphen to link the words in a pre-noun compound modifier, but omit the hyphen when an ly adverb precedes an adjective. Now, pre-noun modifiers can proliferate, sometimes poisonously. Take a look at the example provided just a few lines down on page 162. Faculty Curriculum Committee meeting minutes. Now, there's nothing wrong with that grammatically. Everything makes sense. But hopefully you'll agree that it becomes rapidly difficult to read. Break it up. Use some preposition, probably of. So the example provided, the fix provided, is the minutes of the faculty curriculum committee meeting. Still not fantastic. You've still got a 4-word string there, but at the very least we've got the minutes out of it. Exercise 28 on page 162 is a good exercise. I recommend you do it. It's mostly about punctuation, but remember, punctuation isn't optional. It's a way of breaking the sentence up for readers so they can understand what you're trying to say. Okay, let's jump over the head word and talk about post-head word modifiers, which are probably more important. Now, the first example the text provides here is prepositional phrases. Now, you'll remember we can use prepositional phrases as adverbs as well. The man ran behind the shed. And you can see behind the shed is modifying run. But what about a prepositional phrase like in our building? The security guard in our building knows every tenant personally. It's still a prepositional phrase, but it's clearly not modifying a verb anymore. It's modifying a noun phrase, the security guard, or in fact, it's modifying guard because it's part of the noun phrase. Now, you could nearly argue that post-head word prepositional phrases, similar to many post-head word groups of words, are really a sort of a foreshortened relative clause. The security guard who works in our building. The meeting that was held during our lunch hour, etc. However, you can drop the relative particle and the verb and simply leave the prepositional phrase. So we could view these post-head word prepositional phrases maybe as tiny little relative clauses with the relativizers and the verbs taken out. Maybe. Now, regarding prepositional phrases, remember what I said about editors. Newspaper editors, they hate small words. Now, is there any way you can take the with out in a phrase like an elderly lady with white hair? Yes, an elderly white-haired lady. What about guests for dinner? Yes, dinner guests. The soliloquy in the second act. Get that in, out of there. The second act soliloquy. Sometimes you can replace a noun plus prepositional phrase with an entirely new word. And we're into the realm of power words here, I hope you'll agree. A bunch of flowers sounds nice, but why not say bouquet? Birds that fly south in the winter, migratory birds. There's a particular word in the fix there that has punch, migratory. Makes the speakers sound educated, and it compacts everything in that sentence. It's an important thing. And for that reason, I would recommend that students learn how to avoid the small words or the groups of words and develop strategies for inserting power words or changing word order to get rid of those small words. Okay. In addition to prepositional phrases, you can have adjective phrases, and they usually behave kind of like little appositionals. Let's take the two examples provided not far under the heading there on page 163. The hot, tired hikers trudged the last mile to their campsites. Now you can see we've just got two adjectives there. And you can add and, can't you? That's why the comma's in there. The hot and tired hikers. But can we move the hot and tired over the word hikers and make them post headward? We sure can. The hikers, hot and tired, trudged the last mile to their campsite. Same with the second example. This highly unusual banking crisis calls for extraordinary measures. What can we do with highly unusual? We can move it after the headword. This banking crisis, highly unusual, calls for extraordinary measures. So it is possible to move adjective phrases after noun phrases, but do remember, you now have to set them off by commas. And I'm going to say this again, and I'll say it several more times over the course of this lecture. These adjective phrases that you find after nouns behave rather like foreshortened relative clauses. The hikers who were hot and tired. The banking crisis, that was highly unusual. In a way, you're just taking the relativizer out and the verb, aren't you? Okay, participial phrases. We're sort of in the same realm again, aren't we? The helicopter hovering over the roof frightened the dogs. The travellers lined up in front of airport security did not look happy. Now, I feel that those two are improvements on the two sentences, the two base sentences demonstrated on page 165 there. The helicopter hovered over the roof and frightened the dogs. It seems like two things happened there. There was hovering and there was frightening of dogs, and they don't seem as connected as when you say the helicopter hovering over the roof frightened the dogs. Now, what's happened really is the participial phrase hovering over the roof feels much more connected to the helicopter. So it's both the helicopter and its hovering that are frightening the dogs, whereas the alternative, the helicopter hovered over the roof and frightened the dogs, it seems like there are two separate actions going on. Okay. I think that's all I want to say about participial phrases. Did I mention that they also behave like foreshortened relative clauses? The helicopter that was hovering over the roof. The travellers who were lined up in front of airport security. All that's missing are the relativizer and the verb. Right. If the participle is a single word, just make it an adjective. I know it isn't really an adjective, it's a participle, but it's behaving like one. So you can't really say, our visitor, snoring, kept the house awake. Grammatically, it's okay, but it sounds weird. Just move the snoring back to the start. Our snoring visitor kept the household awake. Participial phrases, on the other hand, can move. You can put them around. You can move them to various places in the noun phrase. Looking out the window, my mother waved to me. My mother, looking out the window, waved to me. That looking out the window can move around. And that's an important ability. You'll understand participial phrases, slightly like clauses, encode a great deal of information, and therefore, when moved around, can change the meaning of the sentence quite radically. Bear in mind what the text says there at the top of the page 166. Only participial phrases that are set off by commas can move. And only if it modifies the subject. So, looking out the window, my mother waved to me. Could I be looking out the window? No. It has to be the doer of the action. All right. Now, that one word participle, particularly if it's a past participle, can be a great way to open a sentence. It's a sudden jerk awake. Look at the example several lines down, page 166. Exasperated, she made the decision to leave immediately. I like it. That sounds a lot better than the exasperated woman made the decision to leave immediately, or the woman who was exasperated made the decision to leave immediately. And you can feel, I hope, the cohesion of that exasperated. Something happened in the immediately preceding sentence or sentences that caused her exasperation. There's excellent cohesion there. Okay. Let's see. Yes, and the text echoes this halfway down the page by saying the reason for choosing one position over another has to do with sentence rhythm and focus. Okay. There are several nice examples provided at the bottom of page 166 and the top of page 167. But again, what I've just told you over the past minute or two is echoed in the shaded box on page 167. The participle can open or close the sentence only if it modifies the subject. It's the same as participial phrases. Outraged, the entire committee walked out of the meeting. Could the meeting be outraged? No, it has to be the entire committee because they're the subject. Now, you'll see there are two asterisked sentences halfway down page 167. Why are they asterisked? They're unacceptable. First one, having slept little on the plane, the thought of a meeting was unwelcome. Now, you can understand what's meant here. Somebody didn't sleep well on the plane and therefore didn't want to go to a meeting. The problem is that participial phrase attaches itself immediately to the subject of the main clause, and the subject of the main clause is the thought of a meeting. Now, thoughts of a meeting cannot sleep on planes. How would we fix this? Let's make someone have sleeping problems on the plane. Having slept little on the plane and did not want to think about the meeting. That makes much more sense. Second example, furiously filling in the bubbles on the answer sheet. The time was up before I could finish the test. Now, we're nearly there in that there's definitely a subject before I could finish the text. There's an I there. The problem is that's in a subclause. And we're looking to attach that participial phrase to the subject of the main clause, which is the time. And times cannot fill in bubbles on answer sheets. So let's look at the fix. Furiously filling in the bubbles on the answer sheet, I still wasn't able to finish the test before time was up. Much better. Because now the subject of the main clause, I, is also the same person who's having problems filling in the bubbles on the test. Now, there are several small exceptions to this provided in the second half of page 168 here. Speaking of silent movies, have you seen The Artist? But these are idiomatic phrases that have fallen into common use. And even though the rule is technically being broken, speaking of, who's doing the speaking? It's understood that it's a sort of a general speaking of. In our conversation, speaking about this has occurred, and therefore have you seen The Artist? Okay. I think exercise 29 is a good reinforcing exercise on this. Please do it in your own time so as to eliminate those dangling participles participles that aren't inherently connected to the subject of the main clause. Now, we move on to an important section of post-head word modifiers, and that is the section discussing relative clauses. I've been speaking about relative clauses on and off for some of this discussion because I've been arguing that these phrase post-head word modifiers are really just fragmented relative clauses themselves. The security guard in our building, blah, 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 is more or less the same as the security guard who is in our building or the security guard who works in our building. So all we're doing on page 169 is finally getting on to real relative clauses. The helicopter that is hovering over the roof. The travelers who were lined up in front of airport security. Two things, open relative clauses. Number one, a relative pronoun like that or which or who, or a relative adverb which introduces clauses explaining place, clauses explaining time, or clauses explaining reason. Okay. Let me see. We've spoken about who and whom in the past. I'm not going to hammer on about this. There's a little introduction to who, whom, and whose on page 170 at the top there. Just remember that the who, whom, or whose is relevant only to what's going on in the subclause, not in the main clause. So the man ate my sandwich. You can see that the man is the subject of the main clause there, the only clause in fact is. But what about the following? The man whom I saw on the street ate my sandwich. Now, why is it whom, which is the objective form? Because it's the object in the subclause. I saw somebody on the street. I'm doing the action in the subclause, so he is the subject of my, the object of my scene. I saw him on the street, so it's going to have to be whom, the man whom I saw on the street. So you choose who, whom, or whose depending on the role that the word is playing in the subclause, not the main clause. Now, there's an important mention of restrictive clauses and non-restrictive clauses on page 170. I take that back. We're going to be speaking a little more about them in a moment, but not quite yet. The important thing here is simply that if the clause is non-restrictive, you can't delete whom, for example. John Lee, whom the manager traded, later became Rookie of the Year. But if it's restrictive, you can drop the whom. Let's see. King Edward VIII gave up the throne of England for the woman he loved. Isn't it interesting that you can drop the whom there? The woman whom he loved. Now, it isn't the who or whom. It's the restrictivity or non-restrictivity of the clause. Now, we'll speak a little more about restrictive and non-restrictive clauses in a while, but just bear that point in mind. Okay. Broad reference clauses. Now, I'm going to jump ahead of the example at the bottom of the page on 171 to the top of page 172. Joe bought a gas guzzler. which surprised me. Now, hopefully you'll agree that the which there is referring to the entire concept of the preceding clause. It's not Joe, it's not the gas guzzler, it's the fact that Joe bought a gas guzzler that surprised me. So this which here is broad reference. It's referring to everything in the previous clause. On the other hand, if I were to say Joe, who ate my sandwich last Friday, bought a gas guzzler, you would agree that the who in the subclause there is very specific. It's Joe himself. Now, broad reference is fine if there's no danger of ambiguity, but there frequently is. And if that's the case, maybe you should throw in a noun to explain what happened in the previous clause. So look at the fix, 1/3 of the way down 172. Joe bought a gas guzzler, a decision that surprised me. And you can see a decision, which the text is calling a summative modifier, is summarizing what happened in the previous sentence. Joe's decision to buy a gas guzzler. Exercise 30 hammers this home. Do that. I think it's well worth doing. It'll make you aware of broad reference. And the reason I'm asking you to do this is I see a lot of ambiguous broad reference in student writing. So it's well worth fixing. Now, we were talking about restrictive and non-restrictive clauses, and I got ahead of myself and started talking about it about 5 minutes ago. Now I want to talk about it. Now, the section beginning 173 on punctuation of phrases and clauses might tempt you to close your eyes and put your head down because you're thinking punctuation, oh God. However, this is a really important facet of punctuation. Now, I'm going to give you 2 sentences. They're both going to sound exactly the same, except I might try to add extra emphasis for the commas. Okay, here's the first. The student who was using a smartphone got low marks. Now, hopefully you'd agree that there was more than one student, but it was the one who was using the smartphone who got low marks. Now, how about the following? The student who was using a smartphone got low marks. Now, in this case, the smartphone doesn't have much of a connection to why the student got low marks. In fact, it's clear that we were talking about the student in some other context in a previous sentence. We're just providing a little more information about the smartphone in that second sentence. Now, the only difference between the first sentence and the second sentence is we are setting off the relative clause with 2 commas. One after the student and one before got low marks. So the student, comma, who was using a smartphone, comma, got low marks. Now, the first example without commas is an example of a restrictive clause. The student who was using a smartphone got low marks because it narrows it down to one student, and that was the one who was using the smartphone. So it's restricting it. The second example is where the subclause, the relative clause in this case, is just providing a little more information about the student, but it isn't separating that student from anyone else in a group. So note the shaded box on page 174. Use commas to set off commenting modifiers. That is to say, non-restricting modifiers. Modifiers that just add more information about whoever's been spoken about. Yeah. Um, I'll leave that. Okay. That brings us. I like exercise 31, separating or distinguishing participial phrases and relative clauses, and whether they're restrictive or non-restrictive. Give that exercise a try. I find it very instructive. I'm even more excited by exercise 32 because the whole point is to get you to start combining information. So you're being provided with two sentences and being asked to make one sentence of them. So you're compartmentalizing information and making those sentences work harder for you. I said two sentences. I see these actually have sometimes two or three. So combine all three. Right. I guess I can draw your attention to the punctuation rule on page 177. All it's saying is when you're setting off a clause, do so with two commas, not one. That is to say, take a look at the rule at the top, well, the 1/3 of the way down the page, 177. Do not use a single comma to separate the required units in the basic sentence. By a single comma, they mean if you're going to separate a relative clause from the sentence, do so with two commas. My mother, comma, sitting by the window, comma, is talking to herself. Okay, that's Adjectivals, and I will finish this lecture now. Hope it was useful.